Today, we are delighted to be joined by Simon Baugh. He is the former Chief Executive of the UK Government Communications, and he's now founder of Kingsford Strategy. Simon brings with him extensive experience leading communication at the highest level of government, which he also shares through his blog and podcast called Cut Through. In this session, he's going to focus on how communication can build trust in practice, drawing on approaches such as working with trusted intermediaries, delivering more relevant and locally grounded messaging, and adapting to an environment shaped by new digital platforms and artificial intelligence. Thank you very much, Simon, and it's over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes at the start about three things, really. The first is how our information environment has changed. The second is what it means for trust in government institutions and what we need to do differently to earn that trust. And then the third is some ideas for what the winning strategies may be to earn attention, build trust, and drive outcomes in this changed environment. So I've been introduced. You don't need to know any more about me. Let's get straight into what our new information environment is. And while some of this might be familiar, what I want to really do is try and understand the deep fundamental drivers and what is leading to the change that we're seeing in our information environment and what that means for communicating to the public. So in my Substack over the last few months, I've been outlining four big disruptors that I think have changed our information environment. And the first of those goes back 30 years to the advent of Google search. Why that really mattered was not just the tech, but the way that it started to shift influence away from traditional information gatekeepers. Because throughout history up to that point, it had been newspaper editors, broadcast editors, those who controlled the information environment, who decided what it was important for people to see. But following the advent of search and the web, for the first time, almost anybody could find almost anything. Then the next big shift is, I think, probably not social media per se, but the combination of social media and the smartphone. And the smartphone mattered because of its screen more than anything. That meant that you moved from pages where people got to the end of a web article or a newspaper article to an infinite scroll of information. And combined with the ability of people to publish and distribute anything, communications started to actually change as a discipline. It moved from being a contest of ideas to a contest for attention. And what we started to see was the way to capture people's attention was through emotion. And so emotion started to trump good facts and ideas as a way of grabbing the public's attention. And then in 2009, the way that Facebook started to distribute information changed. Up until that point, the information that you saw on your news feed was in reverse chronological order and from your immediate network. So you saw what your friends or family had posted, with the most recent content appearing first. But then from 2009 onwards, and really accelerating in 2011, machine learning algorithms were used to tailor content based on what maximized engagement. It was pitched as being the type of information that you were actually most interested in because it was what people interacted with. And at one level, that sounded entirely reasonable, but there were unintended consequences that I think we're now living in terms of our information environment. Most especially, the audiences started to become more fragmented, and authority or the size of your network no longer guarantees reach. I think that's been accelerated even more in the last few years since the new TikTok algorithm came in 2018, which has been followed by most of the other social media platforms. That took that to a more extreme degree where almost none of the content is shared based on authority or followers. It's based on a simple triage as to whether the content engages people. And then finally, and perhaps most profoundly in the last 2 or 3 years, is the consequences of the invention of the AI transformer in 2017, which is not just meaning that anyone can find anything or that anyone can publish and distribute anything, but also that they can now create almost anything. In addition, the advent of AI-driven behavioral targeting and synthetic audiences is going to further increase the ability of people to personalize information and therefore lead to greater fragmentation. And AI deepfakes are reducing trust. Now, that's what's happened, but what has it actually done to our information environment? Well, we've become much more democratized, and I don't pass judgment on whether these are a good or a bad thing, but traditional information gatekeepers have been swept away. Almost anyone can now discover, access, publish, create almost any content. What that means is that authority of traditional institutions no longer guarantees attention. We've also become more fragmented, content's become more personalized. We've used to initially talking about polarization. I think fragmentation is a better description of where we are, with audiences more splintered and in ever more siloed segments, which really weakens the ability to forge consensus or communicate to the public at large. We're also in an information environment where the information and content itself is abundant. As the cost of producing and distributing and creating content has fallen to nearly zero, the volume has exploded, and that makes capturing people's attention much more difficult. And we've also got a more corroded information environment where misinformation travels as easily as truth. The quality thresholds for what gets published have disappeared as some of those traditional information gatekeepers have disappeared, but also the drive for algorithms that prioritize content that provokes emotion or outrage has further reduced the quality of content. And that means that even if you're producing high quality content, the trust overall in all content has become harder to establish. And finally, and somewhat paradoxically, information and the power over the visibility of that information in particular has become concentrated. It's become dependent on the decisions of a small number of tech companies. So you might depend on one specific platform to be able to reach your audience, but that platform might change its algorithm overnight, resulting in your ability to reach those followers that you had being changed almost instantly. And so depending on individual platforms has become a strategic vulnerability. Given that I'm speaking to lots of people who no doubt have an economics background, I thought that I would put this into terms of what has become scarce in this information economy over the last 30 years. The democratization means that authority has become scarce. You're competing with everyone. Your individual institutional authority does not guarantee reach. And that means that you need to earn authority by building relationships with your audience in a different way through relevance to them or utility to their lives or being able to demonstrate useful delivery. The fragmentation of our information environment means that the common ground has become scarce. Shared reference points have eroded. And I think that rather than pretend that hasn't happened, increasingly communicators need to segment audiences and tailor messages, focusing and understanding what audiences care about, their policies and issues that they prioritize, which platforms they use, and who they trust. Because without that, it's very difficult to be able to reach those different audiences successfully. The abundance of information means that attention has become scarce. Your message is now competing with the entire library of human knowledge that is online. And so communications has moved to be a contest for interruption, which means that governments and public bodies need to be able to design for engagement for their target audiences, combining distinctiveness with emotion where appropriate, and also I think understanding behavioral science and audience insights more effectively to be able to tailor content for specific audiences. And in a world where information has become corroded and dis and misinformation can travel quickly, what's become scarce is credibility because people's propensity to trust even authentic content is reducing. And I think that means having a more deliberate and intentional approach to understanding what drives and what drags on trust in your organization, as well as a necessity to partner more with those who your audience does trust. And then finally, that concentration means that what has become scarce is the power over visibility, that decisions about what gets reach, what is visible to people, are made by the algorithm decisions of a few tech companies, and increasingly the way that AI summarizes and mediates your content. And that means that your audience reach is rented rather than owned, and your platform dependency may be a strategic vulnerability. So being able to actually diversify channels, think about how you can reach audiences more directly and understand and influence what AI says about you is becoming increasingly important. No, I won't spend long on this because I think will be aware of it. This it shows that trust in national government is low. I think the most recent figures show that it hadn't declined significantly since 2025, but we are in an area of low trust and an area where trust has declined over the same time as our information environment has evolved. And I think that means that for communicating on the public finances, it's time to think about a different approach. My impression is that for most organizations, the external information environment has changed much faster than the communications operating model. Most organizations still have a press office, a digital team, external communications or external affairs team, and marketing and advertising. I think that is no longer a model that reflects the way that people consume information today. What's happened is, as it's become more difficult to win attention and trust has dropped, communications teams have simply been asked to do more. But the cycle of internal improvement is slower than the cycle of external change. And media organizations still remain important, but they're insufficient to be able to reach audiences by themselves. I think what you often see is communications teams that end up in a situation where they are adopting an everything, everywhere, all at once comm strategy. And that doesn't work in terms of cutting through with key audiences. So, what are the winning strategies for this new information environment? Well, I think before going into those, there's one other question that we need to understand, which is what actually drives trust in public institutions and public messaging. And when I was working in government up until November of last year, I was a member of the executive committee of the Cabinet Office and number 10 Downing Street. And I was the person who was responsible on the cross-government risk register for the risk that was described as public trust in government, which I always found slightly unfair because I didn't feel that either I was entirely responsible for a lack of trust in government or that all of the tools that were needed to restore it were at my disposal. But I did spend some time really trying to understand what it was that built trust in government. And I think the most influential piece of work that I came across was one that was published just last year by Jerry Stoker, who's a professor of politics and government at Southampton University, and others on drivers of political trust. And he identifies three core areas that seem to be most influential in driving trust in government. The first is competence. How do people perform in their core role? The second is benevolence. Do people feel that government cares about people like them? Do they feel that it's acting in their interests or its own? And the third is integrity, perhaps the thing that people often think of most when they think of trust. Do they keep their promises? Do they have high ethical standards? Do their actions match their words? Interestingly, I think the most important of those, the primary driver of trust in government, is benevolence with competence and integrity playing an important but secondary role. And I felt as the person responsible for communications in the UK government that this was a useful model for starting to then think about what were the drivers of supporting government and the drags on support, rather than just thinking about trust, where I got the unhelpful response from some academics of, well, if government wants to be trusted, it should just be more trustworthy. You can start to really analyze and break down what will be the things that would drag on public support in government or help to drive it. And it gives you an opportunity, I think, to start to systematically fix some of the things that drag on support, but just as importantly, to work out where there are perception gaps between what people think is happening on the drivers of support and where their perception might be. So, a good example, I think, would be violent crime or knife crime in London, where the trend has been on a downward trajectory for nearly 20 years, but people's perception is that the problem is worse than it has ever been. The other point that I think is interesting and important here is that the benevolence factor, which is the most important driver of trust, actually is not so much about messaging, it's much more about process. So being able to drive a sense that government actually cares about citizens or acts in their interests is partly about the way in which government interacts with citizens, the way it listens and responds to their concerns. And I think that starts to give us some indications as to where we might build support. So, what I wanted to do finally, before then opening this up to questions, was bring those two elements together. We know how the information environment has changed and what that means communicators need to do differently. And we also now know what it is that drives trust in government. So, is it possible to think about winning strategies that would bring those together in a different way? I suppose the starting point is to say that unfortunately, the strategy that is proving most effective today is not a positive one for most OECD governments. The successful strategy at the moment is taking that mistrust and distrust and harnessing it effectively by political parties or candidates positioning themselves as outsiders and railing against traditional institutions as being out of touch and untrustworthy. And in a low trust environment, in the absence of a better strategy, I think that is proving to be the most effective one. So, what are the strategies that you can pursue if you are not seeking to harness distrust? Well, the first I want to talk about is what we set up in the UK government about 18 months ago, which was a unit called the New Media Unit, operating out of 10 Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. And it was built on a hypothesis developed from the work that I've articulated so far, combined with some analysis that we did of our digital content and what seemed to be working most effectively to build trust. And it's probably easiest to illustrate it by explaining how we had traditionally done digital content in UK government. We had usually used our owned channels, predominantly X, because that was where the debate happened in Westminster, to promote content that was fronted by politicians and that was explaining or promoting the achievements or policies of the government. What we found, probably unsurprisingly, when we looked at the detail of the content, is that when a politician fronts a piece of content, people tend to scroll past it within the first 3 seconds. And that because there is low trust, when people do see content from a politician, they almost immediately dismiss it and are distrustful of what is being said. So we felt that actually, if we adopted a completely different approach, perhaps that would be more effective. And so our hypothesis was that if we had politicians nowhere near the content, and instead we made the content as honest, authentic, and relevant and useful to people's lives as possible, that they may engage with it in a different way. So, on community diagnostic centres, which were new National Health Service centres that helped people to access tests and diagnostics procedures outside of visiting normal hospitals, what we would traditionally have done is had the Secretary of State for Health explain how we were delivering new community diagnostic centres right across the country. But instead, what we did with the new media unit was create hyper-local and relevant content tailored to local audiences, presented by people that they trusted. So in this particular example, I think this is the example from Lincoln in the east of England. And rather than being a general video, it was specifically introducing people in Lincoln to the new community diagnostic centre in Lincoln. It was fronted by nurses and sonographers, and it explained to people in a useful way how they could access the service and how they could get a referral from their local doctor. What we found was that compared to both the national messages that were the same and compared to the traditional form of content, it massively overperformed on trust and engagement. People were willing to listen to messages from government when they were relevant to them and useful to them. The second strategy that we pursued was to borrow trust, to partner with those who our audience already trusted. So this wasn't just working with people like doctors and nurses within the National Health Service, but working with content creators who perhaps didn't have anything to do with what government was providing, but were trusted and followed and engaged with by the audience that we were trying to reach. So for the Get Into Teaching campaign, which was our teacher recruitment campaign, we worked with these four content creators, among others, to help people to understand what it was like to go into teaching. And it allowed us to reach an audience that we could never have done alone. A good example of this working, I think, is actually on another campaign which was around school breakfast clubs, where we had two pieces of content telling the same story, helping parents to understand that we were extending school breakfast clubs to a new group of children. And we had one piece of content that featured the Secretary of State for Education explaining the new proposals. And we had another piece of content developed by a parenting influencer telling fundamentally the same story, but in her authentic voice to her audience. And what was really instructive, I think, was the comments that appeared under the two pieces of content. The one from the politician was cynical at best, abusive at worst, whereas the one from the content creator was just genuinely interested and interacting to understand more about what the new offer was. And so I think it was a good demonstration that the messenger can be as important as the message. And in order to reach audiences who don't trust government today, you need to be able to work out how you can partner with those who are trusted. The third example, and it's one that I think was underutilized within UK government, is about co-creating trust, including citizens or audiences in developing product services or policies. And I think the country that has done this really well is the Republic of Ireland with its citizens' assemblies, inviting the public to help deliberate and respond on important policy questions. Part of the thinking behind this goes back to that point on the earlier slide around benevolence and the idea that the way in which government responds can engages citizens can be as important as the message it is giving. The ideas of psychological theory around agency or effort reward suggest that people even having a small amount of interaction or say in how a decision is reached can have a big impact on them supporting the outcome, even if it wasn't the outcome that they would initially have supported. And then the final suggested winning strategy is demonstrating trust, actually being more transparent and open about choices and trade-offs, and being more explicit about uncertainty and showing the balance of risk. The thumbnail image that I have here is of the way in which the UK government's chief medical officers explained why we were now recommending against the use of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine for younger age groups. And up until that point, the AstraZeneca vaccine had been recommended, and it was clearly felt like it was going to be a difficult announcement to explain why that advice was changing. And the approach we took was just to be very transparent about the balance of risk for different age groups from contracting COVID and from the vaccine itself. And I think that did a really good job of helping people understand why the advice had changed on the basis of the science, and actually landed much more effectively than I think it might otherwise have done. So I've also just thought about how might these four strategies be applied to public finances. Well, let's start on the right and the demonstrate trust, because I think this is something that is very familiar to those who are communicating on the public finances. We're often open about the constraints and uncertainty in forecasts, and we publish independent forecasts. When the Bank of England and other central banks report on their forecasts, they include uncertainty within those, and they publish the minutes of their meetings showing how the votes split. They don't pretend that there was consensus when there wasn't. And so I think that there are good examples, including when Liz Truss was Prime Minister and actually published a budget without those independent forecasts, of how now demonstrating trust and being transparent and open is regarded as the minimum built-in expectation for communicating on the public finances. But I think the other three areas are all opportunities where, while not easy, there may be ways of engaging audiences more in questions around public finances. So citizens' assemblies probably aren't a good model by themselves for determining budget decisions, but I think actually thinking about how citizens might be invited to test choices and understand what giving different amounts the consequences might be for services or taxes or debt is something that may be done. And actually being able to work out how citizens could contribute in advance of budget decisions and make their views known, and for politicians to explain how they took those into account, I think is something that could potentially build trust and confidence. I think content creators is about doing more than just having independent institutional voices. It's about working out how you can reach a different audience. And I think there is an opportunity here with a big brand of trusted personal finance content creators. So in the UK, it would be someone like Martin Lewis of Money Saving Expert, who provides very trusted advice to the public about personal finances. What this isn't suggesting doing is getting them to create content or advertising on your behalf. What we did in government was invite a round table of different expert content creators in to just have an honest conversation with ministers about how they were reaching their different choices. So, for example, we invited 10 to 12 health influencers in to have a conversation with the Secretary of State for Health. And we did the same with some finance content creators to have a conversation with the Chancellor. It wasn't a hard sell, it was just simply a conversation about what were the issues that were of most concern to their audiences, readers, listeners, and to start to have a conversation because we felt that actually we would get a fairer ride in many ways from those content creators than we would from the traditional media because they would understand what was important, but probably be quite unaware of what government was doing. And they were more likely to report the things that would be of value to their listeners or readers than maybe journalists would be. And then finally, I think the new media unit opportunity is to translate spending decisions into outcomes that people can recognize, such as explaining them in terms of the things that will matter to them in their local communities, such as extra appointments, not just nationally, but within their local area or additional police officers within their town. That's not always easily done, but I think that often the temptation is to lead with big numbers that people find meaningless and then use national figures and then be surprised why people don't understand what it means in their local area. Final two slides are just what does this actually mean to how you set up your communications function? Well, I think the starting point is that the fundamentals that have always been at the core of good communications actually matter more rather than less. You need to start with the outcomes, being really precise about what you want people to think, feel, or do differently as a result of your communications. Every comms team now needs marketing level audience segmentation and insight. If you are talking to the public, you're talking to nobody. You need to be clear about the choices and the trade-offs. The information environment is too abundant and too fragmented for you to communicate everything well. So you have to decide what you will not do as well as what you will do and marshal your resources effectively. Fourth, comms needs to be not seen as a downstream activity. It needs internal influence to be able to affect those things that really impact on trust and be able to advise at the most senior level about how to build that trust, fix that trust gap. Fifth, you need good coalitions and campaigns. They've never been more important, and reach and visibility is not going to be just earned by what government or public institutions do, but by building coalitions with civic society groups and private sector organizations that share your goals and values. And six, it needs really meaningful measurement with fewer vanity metrics like followers that give an illusion of reach and much more focus on what audiences are thinking, the outtakes, and what they are doing, the outcomes. And then I think there's also some new capabilities that are needed. Better early warning and data-led and AI-led detection across social, AI search, internal and stakeholder networks, building AI into core workflows to help improve the speed and standards of response while retaining good human judgment and oversight. Using AI to develop synthetic audiences that can give you real-time optimization to understand what's winning attention, how to shift beliefs, and how to drive action. Having experimentation as the standard way of working, including live test and learn loops on messages. There are opportunities to test hundreds of different formats to work out what is engaging people and what isn't. um, and being willing to trade some control for reach by being able to outsource storytelling to partners. That doesn't mean using content creators and giving them a script. They are only going to retain their authenticity with audiences if they are putting this into their own words. And that means being willing to have some people that you work with also criticize you at some times. And then finally, I think a greater focus on crisis comms preparedness, thinking about how to pre-bunk misinformation, conducting pre-mortems to understand what the worst might look like in a year's time, and preparing leaders for a more volatile environment. I'm going to stop there so that I've got some time to answer your questions. But I will just finish by saying that I have a Substack and podcast that shares advice each Tuesday on communications strategy. It's completely free to subscribe, and it expands on some of the strategies and the ideas that I've touched on here. You can access it through that link, or do ask me for help anytime. I'd be delighted to support.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that rich and practical set of insights. Thank you very much to Simon for today's session, and we look forward to seeing you all again shortly. Bye bye, everybody.